The sun had no mercy in Dusty Creek. It pressed down on the town like a flat iron on cotton, bleaching the wooden storefronts pale and cracking the earth beneath every boot heel into a fine, reddish dust. It was a Saturday in the late summer of 1883, and the market square was alive in the way that only frontier towns could manage, loud, unwashed, and buzzing with the particular energy of people who worked hard all week and spent Saturdays pretending they didn't have to. Wagons lined the main road 3 deep. Merchants hollered over one another. A blacksmith rang his hammer in steady rhythm at the far end of the square. Children chased a dog between the legs of horses. Somewhere behind the feed store, a fiddle player scratched out a tune that nobody was quite dancing to, but nobody was ignoring either. The smell of roasting corn mixed with leather and horse sweat, and the faint sweetness of peaches stacked in wooden crates near the corner grocer. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary Saturday. He rode in from the western road just past 10 in the morning. Nobody knew his name. That alone was enough to make people look twice in a town like Dusty Creek, where everybody's grandfather had named a street or a well or a sorry stretch of fencing. The man on the dark horse offered nothing, no introduction, no nod to the sheriff's post, no tip of the hat to the women on the boardwalk. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock that surrounded the valley. His coat was dark and trail-worn. His hat was pulled low. His eyes, when they moved slow and deliberate, the way a man looks when he has learned that the world rarely deserves a second glance but occasionally earns one. He tied his horse at the water trough near the grain merchant, patted the animal once on the neck, and walked into the market square with no apparent destination. The crowd did not part for him, but somehow people stepped aside anyway. He was halfway through the square, mentally noting the price of dried tobacco and salt pork, when he stopped walking, not because anything blocked his path, because of her. She stood at the center of the market square, chained to the old hitching post that merchants used on double market days when the regular posts overflowed. The chain was iron and thick, looped twice around her wrists, and fastened to the post with a padlock the size of a man's fist. She wore what had once been a fine dress, pale blue cotton with white trim at the collar, now dulled by dust and days of wear. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face, but loose strands fell at her temples. Her cheekbones were high, her expression composed, her back straight as a church pillar. She was, without question, the most dignified person in the entire square, and around her neck hung a hand-painted wooden sign on a length of twine. It read, in rough black letters, $1 only. Take her or leave her. The stranger stood still for a long moment. His eyes moved from the sign to the woman, then to the small merchant table beside the post where a tin cup sat waiting, for payment presumably. Then to the heavyset guard lounging on a stool nearby, arms folded, chewing tobacco with the bored expression of a man being paid not to think. The crowd moved around her like water around a stone. A woman in a yellow bonnet glanced at the chained figure and quickly looked away. Two men in rancher hats paused, read the sign, and laughed between themselves before moving on. A young boy started to approach out of curiosity until his mother snatched his hand and pulled him toward the vegetable stalls without explanation. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked. Nobody acted. The woman did not beg. She did not weep. She did not drop her gaze to the dirt the way shame demands. She looked straight ahead at nothing, at everything, with a quiet fire behind her eyes that the stranger recognized immediately. Not defiance. Something older than defiance. Survival wearing the mask of dignity. He had seen that look once before. In a mirror years ago, on a morning he did not allow himself to revisit often. He stood there for only a few seconds more. Then he reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a single silver dollar coin. He walked to the merchant table, set the coin down with a quiet, deliberate click, and turned to the guard. The guard straightened up, suddenly unsure of himself. The stranger did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the worn revolver at his hip. He simply looked at the guard the way a man looks when he has already decided how a situation will end, and is merely waiting for everyone else to catch up. Then he said, in a voice low enough that only those nearby could hear, "Don't touch the lady." He paused. "She's all I have." The square went quiet in that strange, rippling way that crowds do when something important happens and nobody is quite sure what it is yet. The guard opened his mouth, closed it, and stepped aside. The stranger reached into his coat pocket for his folding knife, crouched beside the chain, and in 3 unhurried movements worked the padlock free at its weakest point, a manufacturing flaw any careful eye could spot. The iron fell away from her wrists. He shrugged off his trail coat and held it out to her without a word. She stared at him, not with gratitude, not yet, with the careful, measuring look of a woman who has learned that help rarely arrives without a cost attached. He met her eyes and looked away first, not from weakness, from respect. She took the coat. High on the saloon balcony above the square, half hidden in the shadow of the overhang, a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit watched everything with the patient stillness of a man who owns enough of the world to feel no urgency about owning the rest. His name was Cecil Hargrove, and he had not become the wealthiest man in 3 counties by tolerating surprises. He turned to the man beside him, thin, nervous, always scribbling, and said quietly, "Find out who he is." Me Hutchins had been running her boarding house for 23 years and had learned, in that time, to ask very few questions. She had sheltered runaway farmhands, grieving widowers, traveling preachers of questionable theology, and once memorably, a circus bear trainer who had parted ways with his circus under circumstances nobody discussed at the dinner table. She had learned that the people who showed up at her door in the most unusual conditions were rarely the most dangerous ones. Usually, they were simply the most tired. So when the stranger rode up her porch steps, tall, quiet, trail-worn, with a young woman wrapped in an oversized coat sitting behind him on the saddle, Me looked at them both for exactly 3 seconds, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "I'll put the kettle on." She gave Alina the corner room with the yellow curtains and the view of the peach orchard. She gave the stranger the narrow room at the end of the hall with the squeaky floorboard and the window that faced the road. He thanked her with a single nod and asked only for hot water and a look at whatever lamp oil she could spare. Alina sat at the small wooden table in the corner room and stared at her own wrists for a long time. The marks from the chain were already beginning to bruise twin rings of reddish-purple against pale skin. She pressed her fingers over them slowly, not from pain, but as if confirming to herself that they were real, that all of it had been real. A soft knock came at the door. The stranger set a tin cup of hot tea on the table beside her without being invited in further than the doorway. He was already turning to leave when she spoke. "Why did you say that?" He stopped. "Say what?" he asked without turning around. "That I was all you have." Her voice was composed but direct. "I am a complete stranger to you. You don't know my name. You don't know what I did or didn't do. So why would you say something like that to a person you have never once laid eyes on?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might simply walk away. Then he turned, leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, and looked at her with those slow, deliberate eyes. "Because nobody deserves a price tag," he said, "and because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't require a reason. It only requires that you not walk past it." She studied him. "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one." She accepted that for the moment and wrapped both hands around the tin cup. Over the following days, the boarding house settled into a quiet rhythm. Me cooked. The orchard outside turned gold in the late afternoon light, and somewhere between shared meals and long evenings on the porch, the stranger and Alina began, slowly, cautiously, to talk. She told him about her father, Robert Voss, a fair and careful man who had built his land grant from nothing and recorded every acre in a deed he trusted with his life. She told him how Cecil Hargrove had come to their door 3 years ago with purchase offers that grew larger and more threatening with each visit. How her father had refused everyone. How 6 months after the last refusal, her father had died of what the county doctor called a sudden illness, and how she had never, not for a single day, believed that. She told him about the forged debt documents that appeared the week after the funeral, about the so-called legal process that stripped her of the house and most of the land. About the morning Hargrove's men came to the door, handed her a chain, and told her the remaining debt would be settled publicly, as an example to anyone else in the county who thought defiance was free. She told it all without breaking, but her jaw was tight the whole time. The stranger listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the sunlight leave the orchard. Then carefully he began to tell her something in return. He had been a marshal once, a good one. He had served 7 years across 2 counties, honest and thorough, before a land conspiracy, not entirely unlike Aliner's, had pulled the ground out from under him. A corrupt judge, forged testimony, his badge taken, his reputation buried. And then, worst of all, his wife and young daughter caught in the middle of it, seized as part of a fraudulent property claim by the same network of men who had dismantled his career. He had searched for them for 6 years. He had never found them. Aliner was quiet for a long time after that. Then softly, "Is that what you meant when you said I was all you have?" He looked at his hands. "When I saw you chained to that post," he said slowly, "with your head up and that sign around your neck, something in me recognized it. The specific kind of injustice that uses paperwork and money instead of fists." He paused. "I couldn't save the people I should have saved, but I could spend $1 and save you." Aliner set down her cup. She did not offer him pity. She understood instinctively that he would not want it. Instead, she said, "Then let's make sure that $1 was worth spending." She told him about the deed. Still valid, legally unbroken, hidden in a tin behind a loose stone at the old Dusty Creek post office, placed there by her father the week before he died, as if he had known. The stranger straightened. "He asked me for paper, borrowed her ink pen, and spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table studying the copy of Hargrove's forged documents by lamplight. His years as a marshal had given him something Hargrove had not accounted for, a trained eye for legal construction. At midnight he found it. A notary seal. Dated 3 days before that notary had officially received his license from the county clerk. 3 quiet days before a legal instrument that Hargrove had presumably paid a great deal of money to construct perfectly. He set the pen down, leaned back, and almost smiled. In the morning he told Aliner. She read the flaw herself twice, then looked up at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, not gratitude, not relief, but something cleaner and more absolute. "We take this to the courthouse," she said. "We take this to the courthouse," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment, then asked the question she had been holding since the market square. "What is your name?" He picked up his hat from the table. "I'll tell you when this is over," he said. "A man should earn his name." She watched him walk to the door, then said quietly to his back, "You already have." He didn't answer, but he paused just for half a step before he walked out into the morning. $1. A Wild West tale of honor, courage, and unexpected love. Section 3. The name he earned. $1, a lifetime worth. The road to Hart County Courthouse was 20 miles of red dirt and open sky. Mee had given them her old wagon, a sturdy, sun-bleached thing with a mended wheel, and a horse named Gerald who moved at exactly 1 speed regardless of encouragement. She had also packed them a cloth bundle of biscuits and dried peaches, pressed it into Aliner's hands without ceremony, and told them both to come back in one piece. Then she had gone inside before either of them could see her wipe her eyes. They rode mostly in silence, which had stopped feeling uncomfortable sometime around the 3rd day at the boarding house. It was the silence of 2 people who had already said the important things and were now simply existing in the same space without apology. The morning was cool. The grassland on either side of the road stretched wide and gold under a sky so blue it looked painted. Aliner held the leather satchel on her lap with both hands. Inside it, the forged documents with the damning notary flaw marked in the stranger's precise handwriting. A signed written testimony from Mee Hutchins, who had been present quietly in the back of the room on the afternoon Aliner's father had registered the original Voss land deed 22 years prior, and one empty tin waiting to be filled. They stopped at the edge of Dusty Creek on the way through. Aliner climbed down from the wagon without explanation, walked to the old post office, closed now, boards gray and warping, and crouched beside the foundation stones at the eastern corner. She counted 3 stones from the left, pressed her fingers into the gap, and pulled. The tin was exactly where her father had placed it. She opened it with steady hands. Inside, folded in wax paper and tied with a length of brown string, was a single document. Clean, official, bearing the proper county seal and the signature of Robert Voss in careful, unhurried ink, the real deed. She held it for a moment without speaking. The stranger stood a few feet back, watching the road out of habit, giving her the privacy of the moment without being asked. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in the satchel, and climbed back onto the wagon. "All right," she said simply. Gerald resumed his single speed toward Hart County. Cecil Hargrove was already inside the courthouse when they arrived. He stood near the front with his lawyer, a thin, sharp-dressed man from the city who carried his briefcase like a weapon, and wore the expression of a man attending a formality he had already decided the outcome of. When Aliner walked through the door, Hargrove's eyes moved to her with the cold, measuring look of someone recalculating a number they thought they had already settled. When his eyes moved to the stranger behind her, something flickered briefly across his face. Not fear, not yet, but the first small cousin of it. The judge was the Honorable Samuel Briggs, new to Hart County, transferred from the Eastern District 8 months prior. He was a compact, serious man with reading spectacles and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough courtroom theater to be thoroughly unimpressed by it. He called the proceeding to order without ceremony. Hargrove's lawyer went first. He was polished and efficient, presenting the forged debt documentation with practiced confidence, referring to Aliner as the debtor in a tone designed to reduce her to a category rather than a person. Hargrove sat with his hands folded, watching the judge with the patient satisfaction of a man spending someone else's money. Then the stranger stood up. He was not a lawyer. He held no current title. He stated this plainly at the outset, then laid the documents on the judge's table one at a time in order, explaining each with the quiet, methodical precision of a man who had spent years understanding that justice lives in details. First, the notary seal. The date. The license registration record from the county clerk obtained that morning from the courthouse files, confirming the 3-day discrepancy. Second, Hutchins' written testimony. Signed, dated, witnessed. Third, the real Voss land deed, unaltered, legally registered, bearing every correct seal and signature. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Briggs studied each document for a long time over his spectacles. Hargrove's lawyer attempted 2 objections. The judge silenced both with a single raised hand and continued reading. Hargrove's composed expression had begun, very slowly, to come apart at the edges. When the judge finally set the papers down, he removed his spectacles, cleaned them with his pocket cloth, and replaced them with the deliberate patience of a man about to say something that will not be argued with. "The claim filed against Miss Aliner Voss is hereby declared null and void," he said. "The documentation submitted in support of said claim bears evidence of deliberate falsification. The Voss land deed stands as the sole legal instrument of record." He looked at Hargrove over his spectacles. "Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the county sheriff for investigation into charges of document fraud and unlawful detainment." Hargrove rose halfway from his chair. His lawyer touched his arm. He sat back down. It was, in the end, as quiet as that. Outside the courthouse, Aliner stood in the afternoon sun and let everything go, not loudly. She was not a loud person. But her shoulders dropped, her chin lifted toward the sky, and her eyes filled, slow and steady, with the tears of someone who had held themselves together through sheer will for so long that the release felt less like sadness and more like setting down an impossible weight. The stranger stood beside her. He did not speak. He did not move away. He simply remained, solid and unhurried, the way good men do when words would only get in the way. After a long moment, she looked at him. "You said you'd tell me your name when this was over." He looked at her, and for the first time in the entire length of their knowing each other, he smiled. Not a careful smile, not a guarded one, a full, unhurried smile that changed his whole face and made him look, briefly, like the man he had been before the years took their toll. "James," he said. "James Calloway." She said it once quietly, as if placing it somewhere permanent. Then she said, "You spent $1 to save a stranger, James Calloway. I think that makes you the most expensive kind of man there is, the kind you can't afford to lose." James looked at her steadily. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, "not unless you ask me to." She did not ask him to. 3 weeks later, on a golden Tuesday morning, they were married on the Voss land. The ceremony was small. Me cried through the entire thing and denied it afterward. The wildflowers along the property fence had come into late bloom, white and yellow against the tall grass, and the sky above the Texas plains was the particular shade of blue that makes people believe, without much resistance, that things can be all right. Alina wore her mother's ivory brooch on a dress Me had altered overnight with careful, loving hands. James wore a clean, dark coat and looked, for the first time since anyone in Dusty Creek could remember seeing him, like a man who had somewhere to be. The words were spoken. The promises were made. And somehow, in the quiet moment after, the years of wandering and searching and surviving that had brought both of them, separately, painfully, stubbornly, to a single Saturday market square in a town neither of them had planned to stop in, felt less like suffering and more like a road that had known its destination all along. A month after the wedding, James built a new entrance gate at the front of the property. Alina stood on the porch with her morning coffee, watching him work in the early light. He was unhurried, as always, measuring twice, setting each post with patient care. When he was finished, he stepped back, studied it for a moment, then waved her over. She walked across the yard and stood beside him, reading the wooden sign he had nailed above the gate in clean, careful letters. Calloway Ranch. Built on $1 and everything after. Alina laughed, not a polite laugh, not a careful one, a real laugh, bright and unguarded and full, the kind that had been waiting a long time for the right moment to arrive. James turned to her, reached up and tipped his hat. "Best dollar I ever spent," he said. Behind them, the Texas horizon stretched wide and endless and gold, the same sky that had witnessed the chain, the market square, the courthouse, and the long road between a man with no name and a woman with no price. It witnessed this too, and found it good.